Welcome to Trench Diaries. Juno Beach. Part 3.
At this point, my hope was that the forces in the deeper zone would come forward to reinforce us, or that we would delay the Allies long enough to enable us to fall back to the next defensive line, having done a good job here. I myself was in an aggressive and positive frame of mind. I felt that I had done my utmost in the Goliath bunker and in the hand-to-hand combat, and that I had the feeling that I might make a name for myself in this battle. I told the troops to be ready, and the men lined the slit trenches with their weapons aiming down the slope. We only had a few seconds of uncertainty, and then the Canadians came up from the beach. The first thing that they sent was a Sherman-type tank, which came onto the edge of the path through the minefields and fired on our point immediately. Its first shell went wide, but then the second shell hit the French tank turret and blew up there. The French turret still functioned and fired back. This turret crew had been training non-stop to land their shells exactly where the Sherman was positioned, and they hit the tank with their first round. The shell deflected away across the minefield, but the impact made the Sherman rock on its wheels, and it began to reverse. The French gun fired again, and this hit the Sherman on the front plate somewhere near the tracks. I saw the track fly off to one side, and the whole tank jolted and moved very slowly. Our gun fired again and hit the Sherman on the front plate, which caused a shower of debris and sparks. By now our men were cheering. The Sherman turned its flank as it jerked around in reverse. Our gunner shot it through the side of the hull, and flames leapt up from its rear deck. I saw the engine covers blowing up into the air, and the rear wheels went spinning off into the minefield. Several crew members emerged from the hatches, and at once our machine gun teams opened fire on them. The machine gunners shot wildly at first, and 3 of the crew were able to jump clear. But then our gunners focused their fire and hit the tank. The last 2 crew members who climbed out were shot down on the front of the hull, and their bodies were draped over the gun barrel. Our gunners in their excitement kept firing, and those 2 tank men over their gun were ripped to shreds, with their limbs falling off and their bodies exploding with spurts of flame. I shouted towards the machine gunners to cease firing, but in their eagerness they shot off unnecessary amounts of ammunition, spraying the whole area with fire before they stopped. Behind this wrecked Sherman I could see columns of fire rising into the sky, which I guessed were from the work of the flamethrowers on the bunkers. I was glad that we did not have to face those flamethrowers anymore. I shouted encouragement to the men beside me. I felt very confident at this point, and I almost considered taking a group of troops back towards the beach so that we could make contact with the sea again and become a focal point for reinforcements coming up from the inland sector. I must admit that I had a mental image of myself leading this heroic counterattack and becoming famous due to our resilience. I was very excited, full of energy, and full of hope. But this lasted only a minute, perhaps less. Then another tank came out to attack us. This new tank that emerged from the bunker area was a different model. I recognized it from films of the Dieppe raid as a Churchill series with heavily armored covers over the tracks and a squared-off turret. This tank edged past the burning Sherman tank, pushing it aside. It set off some mines beside the track, but these were anti-personnel mines, and I did not break its tracks. Our French gun turret fired, but the shell bounced off the Churchill's front plate and tumbled away into the dunes. The gun fired again, but again the round ricocheted off, and this worried me because the Churchill was advancing on us quite quickly and firing with its main gun. It fired high explosive shells which blew up one of our machine gun emplacements at the corner of the resistance point. The crew of the machine gun were thrown out of their trench, and they lay badly injured in the barbed wire in front of us. They were moving and crying out for help, but of course there was nothing we could do for them in this situation. Our French gun kept firing, but I think the gunner was panicking by this point because he missed the Churchill twice. The Churchill fired once again, and this round exploded directly on the French turret. It knocked the whole turret off its concrete base, and the thing went rolling away to one side. The gunner remained in the open concrete ring with his whole body emitting smoke and flames. I think he was alive, but stunned and unable to move. At this point, looking over from this poor man to the British tank, I became aware that this Churchill was somehow different in a way from photographs we had seen in our training sessions. We were taught about the strengths and weaknesses of the different Allied tanks, but the training lectures had made no mention at all of what I saw next as the tank halted. There was a burst of flame from a point in the tank's hull plate at the front. After the war, I learned that Churchill Crocodile was the official name for this thing. We came to know it as a Flammenpanzer, or flame tank. And it had a hugely demoralizing effect on our troops. The initial burst of flame from its front hull was only a few meters long, and it set fire to the ground in front of it. The range by now was about 200 meters. One of the troops in the slit trenches fired a Panzerfaust, but this one fell short and failed to explode. The Panzerfaust in June 1944 was still an earlier model with the very limited range, you see. You had to be 100 meters or less. Now, after that initial burst of flame, the Flammenpanzer began to fire at full power, and the effect was completely horrific. It produced a jet of fire, which was a burning liquid of orange-yellow color. This roared out towards us at a very high speed, climbing perhaps 10 meters up into the air. The front of this flame jet spread out to left and right, so that it produced an absolute curtain, or a solid wall of flames. We all watched, dumbstruck by this apparition. The flamethrowers I had seen before were handheld devices, such as the one at the Goliath bunker, and they were bad enough. But this machine was 100 times more powerful. This huge wall of flames collapsed down onto the ground in front of our position, so that it fell onto the 2 wounded machine gun men who were stranded on the barbed wire. They were swallowed up in this inferno of flames. Even at the distance, the heat burned our skin and hair, and the smell of the gasoline fuel was sickening. The flames poured all over the front of our position, and they went gushing into the slit trench there. There were quite a few men in that trench, with their rifles at the ready, and this all happened so quickly and in such an unexpected way that they had no time to escape. I think there were a dozen men there, and they were all set alight at once. I saw that the whole trench was filled with this burning liquid, and the men in there were incinerated where they stood. The heat was so intense that I couldn't breathe properly, even though the flames were about 20 meters away from me. How did the other men react, you might ask? Well, there was a panic. A panic which seized us all, including myself and the other officers. We saw the spout of flame die down as the Churchill ceased firing, but I was gripped by a terror of what would happen if it fired its flames again. Surely, we all would be swallowed up in that orange-yellow fireball. I leapt from my trench, as did all the other men around me, with no thought for rank or discipline. Some of these men were cut down by machine gun fire from the Churchill, and they tumbled around us as we, the surviving men, either threw our hands up in the air in surrender or ran to the back of the point away from the tank. I was among this latter group, which was about half a dozen men, and we ran to the eastern side, getting away from the Flammenpanzer. I still had my MP40, but some of the men had dropped their guns and were simply running like civilians. No weapons, no helmet, just fleeing that wall of fire. 2 of us were hit by machine gun fire from the Churchill, and in the end it was only myself and 3 other men who managed to jump down into a sunken track and run along it. We intended to reach the nearest German line to the rear. At one point I looked back and I saw a huge column of smoke rising from the area of the resistance point, which I assumed was now burned up completely. The 3 men with me, who appeared to be inexperienced, were very shocked by this encounter, and they asked what chance they had of fighting against such machines. I told them that the Flammenpanzer was a panzer like any other, and we could have destroyed it with a pack gun, or, if we had got closer, with a Panzerfaust. But these men remained very low in morale because of what they had seen. After several minutes running along this track, we came around a curve and ran into several German troops in a Hanomag. They shot at us before they realized who we were and accidentally killed one of the men with me. Such killings were regrettable, but inevitable when troops are rushing blindly in such a situation. These Hanomag troops were dressed differently from us. They had camouflage uniforms, and their helmets were coated with foliage. They were armed with the most modern weapons, including MP44 submachine guns and a Panzerschreck weapon, in addition to Panzerfausts. As it turned out, they were a reconnaissance group from an SS Panzergrenadier regiment to the south, and they quizzed us at length about the situation on the coast and what we had seen. They exuded confidence, and this gave heart to me and the 2 surviving men with me, even though the body of the 3rd man still lay dead in the road in front of the Hanomag. They offered us some water, which we took eagerly. In the meantime, their NCO spoke on the radio set with their command. Suddenly there was a strange calm. The skin on my face was burning painfully from the heat of the Flammenpanzer. I leaned on the embankment of the sunken road and composed myself mentally after the action I'd been in. The time was mid-morning and the day was becoming brighter and more humid. There was a constant noise of aircraft overhead and through the branches of the hedgerow, which concealed the Hanomag. I could see large formations of Allied bombers moving south. There were also a number of planes towing what appeared to be gliders. All these aircraft had conspicuous black and white stripes on their wings, and it was obvious that there were no Luftwaffe planes in the sky, not a single one. At frequent intervals, fighter-bomber type planes raced along the fields beside us at low level, strafing the sunken tracks. To move out of cover of this hedgerow, even on foot, would be virtually impossible because of these planes. From the coastal sector, there was substantial shooting and the noise of explosions, but this did not seem to be getting closer. During this break, the reality of the situation sank into my mind. I accepted that this was the major invasion that we had thought might come, with the full resources of the Allies in all spheres, air, land, and sea. My duty in the midst of this historic battle was to find a remnant of my unit and fight onward with them, whether as an engineer or in some other capacity. But the confusion of the whole situation made this unrealistic for the time being, and so I waited with the SS reconnaissance group while they observed the coast and made reports on their radio. The 2 men I had brought with me seemed to be very glad of the pause, but this lull only lasted about 10 minutes. The Panzergrenadiere prepared to move out from under the hedgerow by piling more and more foliage onto their vehicle to try to camouflage it. They planned to move east along the sunken track to observe the Allied advance in that area. However, one of their men returned on foot from that direction and said that 3 Allied tanks were advancing on a sunken road that intersected with ours. In fact, we could see a blur in the air about 300 meters distant over the fields at the top of the embankment, which looked like exhaust fumes or dust from tanks. I cautioned these troops that there were Flammenpanzer tanks in the area. The soldier who had seen them insisted that these were normal Sherman-type tanks, which were advancing inland in a line of 3, with about 50 meters space between each one. These Waffen-SS men became very enthusiastic about the prospect of engaging these 3 tanks with their Panzerschreck. The difference in mentality between these SS troops and the troops I had led at the bunker was remarkable. These soldiers were very eager to attack the tanks, and when one of them was ordered to remain with the Hanomag, he was highly disappointed. I left the 2 men from the bunker with him, and I accompanied these Panzergrenadiere because by this stage I was determined to fight back in some way against the invasion, after the series of defeats I had been involved in already. These troops did not want me to accompany them, but I insisted, and they agreed to hand me a Panzerfaust. There were 6 of these troops plus me. There was the 2-man crew of the Panzerschreck plus 4 SS troops with automatic weapons. We had 3 Panzerfausts with us, and we advanced along the sunken track until a point where it bisected a larger road, which was also partially sunken. The Panzerschreck team positioned themselves to fire along the track towards the crossroads, and the other troops concealed themselves among the ferns and foliage that were growing along the sides of the raised walls of the track. The idea was for the Panzerschreck to fire on the leading Sherman, blocking the crossroads, and then for the rest of us to enter the crossroads and fire on the following tanks. All this was decided in a very cool manner in just a matter of seconds. We could already hear the noise of approaching tanks from the bisecting road, and we took up positions among the ferns and foliage along the side. We primed our Panzerfaust with the firing lever, being careful not to touch the trigger blade underneath as we waited. A few moments later, the noise of tank tracks became very loud, and a Sherman tank appeared in the crossroads, advancing quite slowly, with its gun pointing straight ahead. Our Panzerschreck team fired as soon as it appeared, and the rocket gave out a huge trail of gas and sparks as it shot forward. This rocket hit the Sherman just above the rear set of running wheels, and there was a sizable explosion as it detonated. It appeared to penetrate into the engine compartment because the rear deck of the Sherman immediately lit up with an orange fire, and various pieces of metal flew into the air behind it. The whole tank ground to a halt, rocking on its wheels. The SS men rushed forward at once, and without hesitating, they ran into the edges of the crossroad and looked left to where the other tanks might be. I joined them, kneeling at the edge of the crossroads, and I saw another Sherman. It looked very clean and dripping with water, starting to reverse back down its road. I wondered why it was dripping water, and then I realized that it had come straight from the landing craft on the beach, presumably without even stopping. The machine gunner in the Sherman's hull apparently saw us, because he began firing, but this was quite wild, and the bullets smacked into the earth walls of the track and even into the rear of the burning Sherman behind us. I sighted in on the retreating Sherman and squeezed the trigger blade. The heat of the Panzerfaust rocket scorched my already burned face, but it flew directly onto the Sherman and exploded on his front plate. An SS man beside me fired likewise, and he hit the tank slightly higher up. The 2 explosions caused the Sherman to go out of control, and it slammed into the side of the earth wall covered in smoke from the impacts. The Sherman came to rest across the sunken road, with its track broken and its front drive wheel racing around at high speed. The third man with the Panzerfaust fired into its side, and his projectile blew a hole in the edge of the hull. We threw our spent Panzerfaust tubes away and all looked at each other, and then there was a massive explosion which made us all retreat out of the crossroads. From around the corner of the sunken track, we took a look at the Sherman we had hit, and the machine was exploding to pieces in front of us. It was rocking back and forth, and the turret was partially blown off the hull. From inside, I could see huge explosions in the crew compartment as the ammunition in there blew up. I imagine that it was fully loaded with shells, and coming straight from the beach, it had possibly not even fired a shot before it was hit. Everything was blowing up in there, and sparks from it were setting light to the hedgerows on either side. Beyond this tank, I could just make out another tank reversing away through the smoke. I felt extremely elated at this success. I felt that I had contributed to throwing back the invasion, and that we might have a chance of resisting the entire attack if we could use our precious weapons in the way they were intended. The Panzergrenadiere began to run back to their Hanomag, saying that they would drive quickly into the cover of a forest to the south and from there make their way east to do the reconnaissance as planned. As I turned to leave, though, I saw a sight which shocked me and made me doubt what we were really trying to achieve in this fighting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you know how the algorithm works. Like, comment, subscribe. It means a lot to me. See you in the next video.